Republic for which it stands.
Okay, Ms. Cash has let us know that she's going to be late. Mr. Leone. Ms. Wilczynski also has been excused from tonight's meeting. So I'm going to request a moment of silence for Mr. Robert Biswanger, a retired employee of the North Syracuse Central School District, Anna Armstrong, a retired employee of the North Syracuse Central School District, Mark Dennis, who attended schools in the North Syracuse Central School District, Michael W. Bennett, a 1978 graduate of the North Syracuse Central School District, Joan Polano, a 1955 graduate of the North Syracuse Central School District, and Joyce Sisto, a former employee of the North Syracuse Central School. Okay, we have kind of a short meeting tonight. So we have our initial budget draft presentation. Mr. Keegan.
Good evening. As Pat mentioned, tonight's our initial budget presentation, and we're going to cover a few topics. Some that we've already spoken about, but I've got some updates. We'll talk about the governor's state aid proposal, our estimated tax cap, which needs to be filed with New York State by March 1st. And the information that we're going to present tonight is pretty close to final. I'll still call it an estimate until we dot our I's and cross our T's, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Our preliminary revenue and expense summary. We'll just touch on our fund balance and our reserves a little bit, and then we'll wrap up with our budget process timeline. A lot of words on this slide, and I'll just try to summarize. We've already talked about the governor's state aid proposal, but I can't emphasize enough that the expectations that were set by the Speaker and the Majority Leader, and certainly the New York State School Boards Association believed that we would have a greater amount of state aid this year. The state aid that the governor is proposing is about $991 million for schools. We expected about $2.3 billion, so there's about $1 billion difference, which is pretty significant. The biggest, I think, disappointment and surprise for us, we fully expected that the gap elimination adjustment would be eliminated. The governor is proposing only reducing that by $751,000. To refresh everybody's memory, the gap elimination adjustment is a reduction in aid paid to schools because the state doesn't have sufficient funds to cover the amount of state aid that is calculated using state aid formulas. And we've lost over $45 million in aid, and we fully expected to stop losing aid in the 16-17 school year. No change in the tax cap formula are proposed by the governor, and that will cover that, but that also is putting a lot of pressure on our revenues. The governor's proposal mentions a waiver process for mandates, but we're not optimistic at all that there'll be any real savings from this, and certainly none that we can plan on in our budget process. And the governor's budget proposal highlighted a number of initiatives: community schools, charter schools, Empire State Pre-Kindergarten Grant Program, but none of these are going to have an impact on North Syracuse in 16-17. This is the detail of our state aid, and I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I want to point out a few things. First, foundation aid is the largest component of our state aid. That's the first line on here, and that's going up by about $376,000. The next two line items cover excess cost aid, and that's the aid for our special ed students and programs we have for special ed students, and that has gone up because the amount of money we're spending in special ed has gone up significantly due to an influx of students into our district. The next two line items, hardware and technology and software, library and textbook, those are basically calculated based on enrollment, and you can see that they're slightly down due to slight decline in enrollment. Our transportation aid, we're budgeting that to be flat, which is less than what the governor's budget proposal indicated. But truth be told, we budgeted last year's at about $500,000 less than the governor proposed, and the projections for this year are that it's going to come right in on our budget. So we've got a pretty good handle on that, and I feel confident that the amount in the green number there, our estimate, is a good estimate. BOCES aid is up by about $374,000, and that's because we've been spending more money with BOCES. And then the next line item, the gap elimination adjustment, unfortunately going from $1.9 million down to almost 1.2 instead of down to 0, which is what we hoped. The bottom line is we're getting about, if you go right to the total state aid, we're getting about $2 million more, and that's unfortunately not adequate to balance our budget, which is kind of the one takeaway from tonight's initial budget presentation. I want the board to know that at this point we have a $2 million deficit, and I'll show you some more detail on that in a moment. But we need full restoration of the GEA, which would give us $1.2 million, and we need an increase in foundation aid, about $0.8 million. Although we're very grateful for the increase in excess cost aid, I want to also point out that it doesn't really cover the full cost of servicing our special ed population. And that's due to the way this aid is paid. The school district has to cover the first roughly $31,000 of the cost of servicing those students. And so it does put quite a stress on our P&L, the way excess cost aid is paid. BOCES aid, again, doesn't cover the full cost of programs. Even though we are incented to work with BOCES, they have a salary cap that reduces the aid we get on BOCES programs that we use. So that doesn't help us.
I don't want to interrupt, but
that's okay.
I was actually asking Annette because when I first saw this, I wasn't sure if it was a typo. So we do not receive necessarily all of the money. I mean, I know that our BOCES aid is whatever it happens to be, the 70, 80%, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, we don't receive a certain amount over, like
right.
If they say that we should spend X number of dollars for an employee, then therefore
well, what they do is they hire the employee, but the way the state pays the aid, they cap that aid at $30,000 of the employee's salary. So anything above $30,000 paid for that employee is not aidable. So it goes into the COSER, it gets spread over all the schools that participate in that, and that's a diluting factor in our aid rate.
Right.
And so when we look at some of the programs we do with BOCES, many of them where we're involved in purchasing services and things like that, or items or hard goods, we're getting the full aid amount. But whenever there's a human resource component in that, we are getting shortcutted on the aid, and that's been a topic of conversation for years, that we'd like to see that cap increase, as would other districts in the state.
$33,000 for a full-time employee, 12-month employee.
That means there's a lot of money that's not covered or not
right.
aidable. Yes. And so I think, again, the bottom line on some of the implications is that the proposed state aid that the governor's proposing not only is not adequate, leaves us with a deficit, but it doesn't allow us to restore some of the critical items we've cut in recent budget years. And, I think as a cabinet, as a board, I know we've all been hopeful that we would be able to restore certain things that have been cut over the years. But at this moment in time, this budget does not anticipate our ability to restore those items. Let's switch to the tax cap. The tax cap is looking like our tax levy increase will be a little over 1%, or about $890,000. The big driver in there is the allowable levy growth factor, the center line there, that's 1.0012. It's a 0.12% increase in inflation, and that's the primary driver on the calculation. We did have a reduction in our pilot revenues, and we did have some growth in our tax base. North Syracuse is one of those districts where we actually continue to have new construction. We continue to have expansion of the tax base, and that was worked into this formula in that top line. The potential tax levy increase on a home of $100,000 is about $25.30 if this ends up being our final tax levy increase, the 1.09% indicated here. I like to show this slide because it shows the dependency we have on the tax levy and state aid. You can see that the green piece of the pie and the blue piece total 97% of our revenues. So if our budget is balanced on state aid and the tax levy, and with the governor's disappointing proposal and having to live under the tax cap, our revenues once again are constrained. Go ahead, Pat.
Just to speak to this graph a little bit, I mean, Scott can probably speak to this a little better, and even George and Mr. Schuster. That green area in the past was much larger than it is. The state aid ratios have gone from like a 70-30 to now 50.
Yeah, consistently. We have a chart that I don't have in tonight's presentation, but it shows that the state aid as a percentage of our overall revenue budget has consistently declined over time. A couple of just other items to point out here on our revenues. We've already talked about state aid. Our pilots are down. I don't want people to think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Our pilot revenues, these are agreements, payment in lieu of tax agreements that the district does not negotiate but participates in when new businesses move into the area. And these are agreements that are put in place over a period of time, and when those agreements end, those properties go on the tax rolls, and taxes are levied on the normal course of business. So that's not necessarily a bad thing that our pilot revenues are down. Very modest changes in rent and Medicaid and other revenue. And our revenues, as you can see here, are projected to be $153.8 million, or an increase of 1.96%. Back to that number in a moment. Just a few other things on revenue to keep in mind. We've talked about this every year, the recalibration of interest. We've been in a historically low interest rate environment, and when building projects were done in school districts across the state assumed a certain interest rate would be implicit in those projects, and they paid aid out based on that. But there's a caveat that says they can come back and lower the building aid if the interest rates after 10 years are lower than they estimated. And so that is in fact the case, and we've had this recalibration of interest hanging over our head, and we're just going to have to wait until the legislative process plays out to see what the implications are for us. General state aid, I should just emphasize, and we all know this well, that over the next 5 weeks between now and the end of March, the legislature will deliberate and discuss with the governor the budget, and hopefully there'll be an increase in state aid, but unfortunately that'll come in the 12th hour as it did last year, which is March 31st, so we'll watch that closely. Real property taxes, unless we ask for an above tax cap increase, which requires a supermajority, that's 60% approval of the voters, our levy increase is going to be limited to this 1.09%. And I know a number of districts here in central New York are struggling with negative levies, and that's a challenge. And so we're going to be watching this closely to see what other districts are doing. But right now, the governor or the legislature, no one seems to be talking about changes in the tax cap legislation. And the Smart Schools Bond Act, I feel compelled to just keep mentioning that does not affect the general fund. We are moving forward with that, but those revenues will not cover any general fund expenses. Switching over to expenditures, you can see here on this chart, I like to point out that we're a people-based business. Salaries and benefits represent 77% of our budget. It's the lion's share of our budget, and you can see that our debt service is significant. That's the district's mortgage, and that's a significant component. And BOCES. BOCES represents 9% of our budget. We utilize a lot of services that BOCES we cooperatively purchased with other districts through BOCES. It's a big source of expenditure for us, but also benefits the district greatly. And you'll notice there the thing called special project, the $100,000. As you know, this year we're going to reconstruct, that project is going to be underway shortly, the lobby at the high school to create a different configuration for security. And that is a project that will be fully aidable with state aid, and we're budgeting again next year to include another such capital project of that nature. Again, fully aidable. But you're allowed to include it in your general fund budget if you include it in the budget and the budget gets passed. Just a couple comments on expenditures. As you can see, salaries is our largest increase. I want to point out that that looks like a larger increase than you might expect, and so it warrants some explanation. Our 2015-16 budget, when we put it together, we were negotiating with our bargaining units, and we only included a 1.5% increase in the 15-16 budget. We settled those contracts at a higher rate. And so when we look at the 16-17 budget, when you do a budget-to-budget comparison, piece of the 15-16 that we didn't include in the budget, and the actual increase of 3% that's being paid in 16-17. So that's really kind of a year and a half's worth of increase manifesting itself in the budget in one fell swoop. Benefits, we're fortunate that we were able to make some changes in our health care benefits with our bargaining units agreeing, led by our teachers, agreeing to move to Excelis, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we hope that allows us to avoid some costs by being in a larger network. And so we factored that into these calculations, and we've also seen some improvement in benefits due to TRS and ERS, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. BOCES, we show an increase in BOCES. The largest component of that is the cost associated with servicing our special ed population, and that increase is somewhat mitigated by the increase in excess cost aid that I showed on the state aid slide. The bottom line is our estimated expenditures are $155.8 million, or up about 3.3%. And there's our $2 million deficit, the difference between 155.8 and 153.8. That's the challenge we have in front of us. I've mentioned our health benefits and our retirement costs with the stock market, at least recently doing better. We had some improvement in TRS and ERS rates, and that certainly helps. And so settled contracts for next year are going to increase by 3%. And fuel costs, while we are seeing a decline in fuel costs, and that's always a good budget opportunity, we have to remember that the lion's share of our fuel is used in our transportation division, and the savings we realize in the budget is really only net of aid. So think of it this way: if we save $1 on gasoline, we only really save 25 cents because we're going to lose 75 cents in aid, which is fine, but it's worth noting. Our energy costs, we've locked in a 3-year supply agreement with a number of other school districts, and our budget has been adjusted accordingly. We did that at the end of last year, or did that last year, I should say. And then, obviously, we're continuing to talk to BOCES and evaluate opportunities to control costs and provide better services working with them. And we talked about our BOCES budget already. Another slide that I want to just bring to everybody's attention. It's one that I don't even think we used in our budget presentation last year, but it's one that it was worth noting. There are 23 component school districts in the OCM BOCES. North Syracuse is ranked 22nd in our BOCES in terms of spending per pupil. And spending per pupil is basically your total budget divided by your number of students gets you your spending per pupil. That's the concept. And so we're kind of at the bottom in terms of spending within our BOCES. But look at the number to the far right, the ranking within the state. We're 652 out of 669 school districts. So we're close to the bottom in terms of spending per pupil in the state as well. And it's a number that this has been a consistent ranking. I've been with the district. This is my 5th budget cycle, and that's about where we've stood all these years. So we haven't really moved up in that ranking, and And I think our teachers, our students are feeling that in the fact that our programs have not necessarily been expanded as a result of that. Vehicles. Every year we buy buses. Our objective is to keep our fleet at a reasonable age. We do not want to have many vehicles over 10 years old. They become very expensive to repair and maintain. They run the risk of not passing DOT inspection. So that's our primary motivation for continuing the vehicle purchase program that the district's been involved in for many, many years. This year, though, we're going to add to it a bucket loader used by our M&O department. That's used for snow removal and grounds projects. And our M&O department has had an older piece of equipment that they have held together with duct tape and chewing gum. Honestly, it's been a real effort to keep the thing going, and it just needs to be replaced. And this is the most economical way to finance a vehicle like this. So we're adding that to our vehicle proposition. So our proposed purchases are 10 65-passenger school buses, one 39-passenger school bus, and that's going to have some wheelchair positions and a hydraulic lift as well as air conditioning, which is required by our individual education plans for students, as well as a 48-passenger bus with air conditioning. We'll buy one Suburban. We bought one last year. We currently have two on the road that are coming to the end of their life, and then, of course, the bucket loader, which I've mentioned. So our estimated cost, and I want to emphasize the word estimate, we are still working with Leonard Bus to nail down the final prices on our vehicles, but it looks like about $1.6 million, and that's about $3 per year for a house assessed at $100,000, again, before STAR. That's our vehicle proposition. I want to touch on fund balance, because when you think about financing our budget, it's like our home budgets. We look at how much money we make every year, and then we look at what we have in savings. And if we've got some things we need to do and we want to pay for it out of savings, that's one option we can consider. Our fund balance right now at about $5.8 million is about 3.8% of the proposed budget, of the current budget. I'm sorry, of the proposed budget, excuse me. And that 3.8% is below the 4% target for New York State. So it's not like we have a significant amount of excess funds available for in our general fund budget. The same holds true for reserves. While we've made progress in our reserves represent about 2% of our budget. And when you compare us to other districts, our reserves are quite low. And, we're reserving for things that are very prudent. Our tax certiorari, that is for people who contest their taxes. We've worked with our attorneys to estimate the amount of that potential liability, and this $655,000 represents the amount of disputed taxes at this time. Workman's compensation, we have, with our large workforce, we have numerous claims in workman's compensation. The board increased that reserve as well as tax certiorari last year, authorized that increase. Last year we established and this year funded the capital reserve. But again, at 2%, there's no excess funds in our reserves that would allow us to finance part of the general fund budget. Kind of in summary, we're disappointed in the governor's budget, as I said earlier. We need another $1.2 million by reducing or eliminating the gap elimination adjustment, and another $800,000 in foundation aid. The tax cap formula is becoming problematic. That law, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years, but that's going to be difficult for school districts going forward to live within that cap. State aid and tax levy increases will not support the restoration of before. And I would say to you that after years of cuts, if we don't get more state aid, identifying $2 million of additional cuts to close the deficit is going to be an incredibly difficult job, but will degrade student programs. And so we really need our legislature to come forward, and the governor to come forward with additional funds for the district. And as I just mentioned, the district's reserve and fund balance cannot be used to support the general fund budget. The budget timeline. So tonight we looked at the the initial budget. The numbers are starting to solidify as we're getting feedback from the governor and finishing up those final tax cap items. We hope to come back to the board at the end of March with yet another update to the budget process. At that time, I don't know that we'll have a final state aid number. If it's consistent with last year, we probably won't. We would ask the board in March to hopefully approve the bus bond proposition, which is the vehicle proposition I just talked about, and to approve our notice of budget hearing and election. And then I'm assuming on April 4th we'll know where we stand with state aid, and we will be able to propose a final budget to the board for your discussion and deliberation, and hopefully adoption on the 18th of April. Budget hearing on May 3rd, and then a budget vote on May 17th. Any questions or comments?
Next budget subcommittee meeting.
Well, we had a little confusion. It was scheduled for tomorrow, but postpone that. So it's been postponed. We need to set a new date.
Okay.
We just figured after going through this presentation tonight, we're not at a point where we're ready to move forward with any discussion. We need no news, so we need a little bit of time as a cabinet, and then we will be in contact and we'll have Connie notify.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question, Don. Can you go back to the slide where it shows how much we spend per student? Can you tell us how that is calculated, and who does the state do that? Or?
You know, the New York State issues a school report card, which is the Post Standard did Syracuse.com actually had all these rates published. You could sort by county. You could sort. We can get it through state ed, or you can get it through the newspaper. But they did a big article last year after the budgets and published all this information. The concept is that it's basically your total budget divided by your number of students. And so a couple of things to keep in mind. If you're in a really small school, you can't spread the cost of, your costs are spread over fewer students. So if you're in a larger school, you might think there'd be economies of scale. But in this, I can tell you there are districts on here that are of larger districts that are spending thousands of dollars more per pupil. This isn't, if you look at this is not just economies of scale that are causing us to have a lower number. It's truly lower spending on a per pupil basis. And that impacts the quality of our programs.
I just want to add one additional comment. As Don said numerous times throughout the presentation, we're very disappointed in the governor's budget proposal. Just today, my office has been in contact with our local legislators. We will be setting up a meeting with each of them over the next. Don and I will be going, as well as Liz Cash, who heads the legislative committee, and we've got two very vocal students that we will be and probably Mr. Cleary from.
Don, what other things can the community do? We know the governor has proposed his budget, but it's not set in stone. What can they do? We know, as you pointed out, our budget comes either from the state or the taxpayers. That's it. So,
I think the push right now has got to be to write letters to our legislators and express the concerns that we have about the funding of schools. I mean, it is clearly inadequate. Just the fact that we have formulas that say how much money the state should be providing each district for the students' education, and that we haven't lived on those formulas and we've had to live with this gap elimination adjustment is just clear evidence that we have been underfunded. And, it's one thing to get underfunded one year, but when you have 6 years running of short budgets, it really takes a toll. And it has certainly taken a toll on North Syracuse, as it has a lot of districts. But I think the number one thing that the community can do is express their concerns to their legislator and to the governor.
Well, and to kind of piggyback on that, our Central New York School Boards Association and the New York State School Funding Consortium, Dr. Rick Timms, have provided a list of telephone numbers, addresses, Twitter accounts, any information that would be necessary to reach out to our legislature to kind of open their eyes a little bit. And when we sat through that presentation from the School Boards Association a few weeks back, they were pretty clear that gap elimination for some school districts like us, it's still a big deal. It's a huge deal. When there are other districts that it's been totally resolved, and they're not losing funding. So for us, that's the issue. So I guess what's important is for us to reach out, like Don said, and express our concerns specific to our district, because we need both gap elimination to be eliminated, as well as an increase in foundation aid. Because we're expecting one thing, because we were told, very similar to several years ago where we were told we were going to see a 4% increase in aid and then never saw an increase but a decrease. There have been years, I've only been a board member for 6 years, we've lost $17 million from one year to the next. We've had some pretty tough times over the past 6 years. So, the first year I was on the board, that was probably the easiest budget that I have seen, and every budget since has just become more difficult every year.
That's not even addressing recouping the money that's been withheld from our district.
Right, because we're talking a total of 40-something.
Over $45 million.
$45 million. So, it's, when you're talking $153 million, that's a third of 1 year's budget that's been held. We're not asking for a repayment, which is what the state asked for. Right, but we should. So, yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you very much. So there are no comments from the audience, so we will move into board committee reports, and Mr. Schuster is excited to report back.
Oh, yeah. I attended my first meeting of the Syracuse Regional Airport Authority on February 12th, after you all so kindly appointed me the school district representative to the authority. And coincidentally, that was our training day. Every authority has to undergo training every year. It takes about 45 minutes. And there was an attorney from Albany, from a law firm, that's what he does. He runs around and trains the authorities. But I found, thank God he had a sense of humor, because this was 45 minutes otherwise. It would have been like a root canal or something. But he went through the history of authorities and where they created. And the ironic one, it started in his research with Christopher Columbus, whose boats that he sailed on were not funded by a government, but were private. And that's the concept of an authority, is that private money funds a public adventure. And so Columbus came on boats funded by private people under the belief that he was going to find new lands. It would result in the opening of trade and other commerce, and that the people who funded the boats would make money off it. And he progressed through some of the history into Nelson Rockefeller, who leveled a large piece of the city of Albany and built the plaza, again, not able to sell bonds because in New York State you need voter permission to sell bonds. So that was all done through an authority. Private bonds were sold, the plaza was built, Nelson got his memorial, but that was just, again, another example, as he said, of the use of an authority. The major reason for the training was to develop in us a sense of our duties as to why we're there, who we represent, and he made it very clear. Most of the members of the authority are appointed by the county executive or by the mayor, and then others are town or school representatives. But he made it very clear. He said, your duty is to the authority, not to whoever appointed you. You're not here for the county executive or the mayor, or he looked at me for the school district. He said, you are here for the authority, and you have to vote in the best interest of the authority not necessarily in the best interest of from whom or wherever you came. There's another superintendent of East Syracuse, Donna Desiatos, also on the authority. So it was, again, an interesting thing, but he boiled the whole thing down to this little laminated card they gave us as to what he called the fiduciary responsibility, which, again, he defined. Most people think fiduciary as being financial. He said, that's not it. It's the total responsibility to the authority. And he went through the steps we should all take, and it pertains to all of us, which is why I just like to review it. The first step is to think about the mission of the authority, or in our case of the school district. He's got a picture of a person on here, so he goes through the body. Then you inhale the information, taking as much as you can. You digest it by looking at assumptions, separating fact from fiction, and the accuracy of our own perception. And then, before you step, confirm the absence of a conflict of interest and confirm your independence. And then and only then you can participate and vote. And he put on the other side, he said, you are prepared to vote, but remember, if you have any doubt, time out. So he said, if you have any doubt at all in your mind as to whether or not you should be part of this discussion of that issue, recuse yourself and leave. And I say that in large part for Scott to know that he probably could still be there just following these steps. But thank you anyway, Scott, for nominating me for the seat. I do appreciate that. But again, it's interesting. My term is only 1 year. It'll rotate to one of the towns afterward. We got a meeting next month, but tomorrow I have a 2-hour orientation with the executive director, Christina Callahan. I guess we'll see where that all goes. But everybody was very polite, introduced themselves, welcomed me on board, so I felt very comfortable with that group. So I'm going to enjoy it, frankly. So appreciate it.
And I think it's great that you mentioned that, especially when we are talking about board member elections. That looking back to the first year, that I think Scott was surprised. I sat out there for several months prior to running, and somebody else asked me, what is your agenda? And I remember walking away thinking, oh, geez, I don't really have an agenda. And then I'm somewhat embarrassed, actually responded to them the next day with, I really don't have an agenda. And they said, well, that's good. So I think, that kind of...
That's the whole point. You
Right.
can't be there with an agenda.
Right.
You have to do what's best for the authority,
Right.
not from wherever you came.
And if we talk about, former board members, we have, Mrs. DiBianco used to constantly talk about our fiduciary responsibility. That we have friends, family, children, grandchildren that benefit from our service here, but we can't do things specifically to benefit them. That we have to, sometimes make those tough decisions, which all of us have. Like I have talked about, budget season is not always necessarily the best Easter dinner conversation for my family. But it's important for us to hear that, and I'm glad to hear that another place is kind of echoing what we have done. I think we err on the side of caution when we make decisions. Where we ourselves, not often, but often enough that we're doing it right. So
He made the point very well. He's very good. Thank you.
Do you have any updates? I know we have a policy that we need to discuss as a board, but do you have any other?
We have a number that are on the agenda tonight up for vote. The policy committee met on February 8th. We reviewed 8 policies. 5 were recommended for readoption, 2 were amended and recommended to readopt, and 1 we kind of sent back to have further review. And our next meeting is March 15th.
Thank you. And Ms. Cash is not here for legislative committee, but I think that mentioned they are planning on meeting with our individual representatives. It is important for us as well as the community, to reach out to them, to let them know what your concerns are, whether it's affecting your own taxes, your own education. Some of the students here, when Mr. Keegan talks about our programs, it's the electives that are available to you that have been decreased. It's, funding to Science Olympiad, other things like that, where kids are out fundraising now. NSEF has been a big supporter of us, as well as local businesses. So rather than knocking on their door asking for money, it might be a good idea to knock on our representative's door and ask them for the appropriate money to give us. So, Ms. Speech, do you have any comments?
Just a couple. Thank you to Mr. Keegan for a very thorough budget presentation tonight. We have a challenge in front of us, so working on that over the next few weeks. On a more positive note, I'd like to point out that our cheerleaders have won the CNYCL championship recently, and they will be moving on to the sectional championship on February 27th, so congratulations to them. And also, our girls varsity basketball team, congratulations to Michaela Roberts, who a couple weeks ago scored her 1,000th point. Joins 6 others from the school district over time who have achieved that. And they did beat Utica Proctor in the semifinals last evening, and they move on to the sectional finals next Sunday night at OCC playing West Jenny. And hopefully if that goes well, then they'll move on to Troy for competition. They are undefeated. I believe their record now is 23-0, so quite the team.
Very proud of all of them. Ms. Cash, we went over board committee reports. I did discuss maybe reaching out to legislator and your future meetings with them. Do you have anything that you want to add? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll move into the routine action items. Do we need any discussion on A, B, C, D, or E? No? Do I have a motion to take that as a group? Mr. McClintock? Anybody from this side of the table? Mr. Harrington? All in favor? That's unanimous. Okay, so our first discussion action item is the OCM BOCES, the Onondaga Cortland Madison BOCES board member nomination. Mr. Crabtree is here tonight bearing coffee gifts again. He has been a passionate board member for us previously and stepped in when we needed somebody to, I don't want to say replace, but fill the shoes of Mrs. Sifarada. And he would like to continue in that role. So I guess the recommended action is for the North Syracuse Central School District to nominate Robert A. Crabtree to run for one of the open positions in the OCM BOCES board for a period of July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2019, and to notify OCM BOCES of the nomination by March 18th. So do I have a motion? Ms. Scanlon, second, Ms. Cash. All in favor?
I'm abstaining.
Mr. Marizio is going to abstain due to employment. Okay. And I will say that that's unanimous minus of gifts. A financial donation totaling $50 was made to the Main Street Early Education Program in memory of Mary Vaughn, a special education teacher who recently passed away. Four Dimensions Productions Incorporated has donated $21,854 to the district to support the district's costs associated with BOCES technology leases for new equipment at the North Syracuse Junior High School. The recommended action is to accept with gratitude the above gifts. Do I have a motion? Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Cash is a second. Mr. Marizio, again, will abstain. And all in favor? That's unanimous. The 5-year service contract, do we need any clarification from Mr. Keegan on this? Okay, do I have a motion to accept the resolution for the service contract? Mr. McClintock, Mr. Schuster, all in favor? All but Mr. Marizio again. Okay, the surplus of non-marketable equipment, do we have any need for explanation of that? Nope. Okay, do I have a motion? Harrington, Mr. Farfalia, all in favor? That's unanimous, including Mr. Marizio. Okay, so the policies, we have E, F, and G as Ms. Scanlon had previously discussed. Do we need any other clarification? Scanlon, would you like to make the motion? Ms. Scanlon makes the motion. Second, Mr. Schuster, all in favor? That's unanimous. The instructional or personnel reports for instructional staff, support staff, and administrative personnel. Do I have a motion to accept those as a group? Mr. Marizio, Ms. Scanlon, all in favor? That, too, is unanimous. So at this time, we'd like to make a motion to move into executive session for the purpose of receiving an update on negotiations relative to the maintenance and operations bargaining unit and non-affiliated personnel, to receive an update on a legal matter relative to potential litigations, and to review the employment of 2 individuals with no action to follow. Do I have a motion? Mr. Harrington, Mr. Farfalia, all in favor? That's unanimous. Participation in government students, anybody with a